The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Ezra Clayton's weathered face as he guided his mare through the rocky terrain, searching for his missing cattle. 3 days of tracking had led him deeper into the desert than he'd ventured in months, far from his ranch and the whiskey bottle that had become his only companion since Sarah and little Emma died. The copper mine ahead had been abandoned for 2 years, ever since the Apache raids made it too dangerous to operate. Smart miners had pulled out, but Ezra knew that desperate men sometimes lingered in these forgotten places, scraping for scraps of ore or hiding from the law. As he approached the mine's entrance, his horse suddenly reared, whinnying in distress. The stench hit him then, human waste, fear, and something else that made his stomach turn. He dismounted, his hand instinctively moving to the colt at his hip. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing off the rocky walls. "Anyone there?" A sound drifted from the shadows, so faint he almost missed it. A whimper, barely human. Ezra stepped closer, squinting into the darkness of the mine shaft. That's when he saw her. The Apache girl couldn't have been more than 12, chained to a support beam like an animal. Her dark hair was matted with dirt and blood, her traditional dress torn and filthy. Angry welts covered her thin arms where the iron shackles had rubbed her skin raw. But it was her eyes that stopped Ezra cold, dark pools of terror and defiance that reminded him painfully of his own Emma. "Good Lord," he whispered, dropping to his knees beside her. The girl flinched away, pressing herself against the cold rock wall. Ezra held up his hands, speaking in the gentlest tone he could manage. "Easy there, little one. I ain't gonna hurt you." He reached for the chains, examining the crude iron padlock. "Who did this to you?" The girl said nothing, but her eyes never left his face, searching for some sign of his intentions. Ezra noticed a tin cup nearby, half filled with stagnant water, and scraps of moldy bread scattered on the ground. Someone had been keeping her alive, but barely. "Morton," he muttered, recognizing the handiwork. Silas Morton and his gang had been operating illegal mines all over the territory, using Apache captives as slave labor. Word was they'd branched out into more profitable ventures, selling Apache women and children to brothels in Tucson and Phoenix. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Ezra's blood run cold. He drew his pistol and moved to the mine entrance, peering out at the desert. 3 riders were heading his way, still a quarter-mile out but closing fast. Even at this distance, he recognized Morton's distinctive black hat and the way he sat his horse like he owned the world. "Shit," Ezra breathed. He holstered his gun and rushed back to the girl. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "Bad men are coming. I need to get you out of here." He pulled his knife from his boot and began working on the chain's weak link. The girl watched him with growing hope, but also confusion. White men had brought her nothing but pain. Why was this one different? The chain finally gave way with a soft clink. The girl's legs buckled when she tried to stand, weakened by days of captivity. Without hesitation, Ezra scooped her up in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her body trembling against his chest. "What's your name?" he asked as he carried her toward his horse. She spoke one word, so quietly he almost missed it. "Ayanna." "Ayanna," he repeated, testing the unfamiliar syllables. "I'm Ezra. I'm going to get you somewhere safe." The hoofbeats were getting closer. Ezra mounted his horse carefully, settling Ayanna in front of him. She gripped his arm with surprising strength as he spurred the mare into a gallop, heading for the narrow canyon that would provide cover. Behind them, angry shouts erupted as Morton's gang discovered the empty mine. Ezra didn't look back. For the first time in 3 years, he had something more important than his own grief to focus on, this broken child who needed him to be strong. As they rode through the desert heat, Ayanna's head lolled against his chest, exhaustion finally overtaking her. Ezra found himself whispering words of comfort he hadn't spoken since Emma's death, promising this Apache girl that no one would ever chain her again. The decision was made, though he didn't fully realize it yet. Ayanna was coming home with him, and God help anyone who tried to take her away. The Clayton Ranch sat like a weathered scar against the desert landscape, its adobe walls cracking under years of neglect. Ezra hadn't bothered with repairs since Sarah died. What was the point when you were just waiting to join the dead? But now, carrying the unconscious Apache girl through his front door, he saw his home through different eyes. The place was a mess. Empty whiskey bottles cluttered the kitchen table, unwashed dishes filled the sink, and dust covered everything like a shroud. The house that had once echoed with Emma's laughter and Sarah's humming was now a tomb of memories. Ezra laid Ayanna on Sarah's old rocking chair, the only clean piece of furniture in the room. The girl's breathing was shallow, her face pale beneath the dirt and bruises. He'd seen enough injured animals to know she was dehydrated and malnourished, probably hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. "Stay put," he murmured, though she remained unconscious. "I'll get you cleaned up." He heated water on the wood stove, gathering clean rags and the medical supplies Sarah had always insisted they keep stocked. His hands shook as he worked, not from the whiskey this time, but from something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. When Ayana's eyes fluttered open an hour later, she found herself in a strange room with whitewashed walls and unfamiliar smells. Panic seized her immediately. She bolted upright, ignoring the pain that shot through her cramped muscles, and looked frantically for an escape route. "Easy now," Ezra said from across the room, his voice calm but cautious. He held a bowl of warm broth in his hands, steam rising from the surface. "You're safe here." Ayana's dark eyes fixed on him with the wariness of a trapped animal. She didn't understand his words, but she recognized the tone, the same one her grandmother used with frightened horses. Still, she pressed herself against the wall, ready to run despite her weakened state. Ezra slowly approached, setting the bowl on the small table beside the chair. "You need to eat," he said, miming bringing a spoon to his mouth. "Food. Eat." The girl's stomach betrayed her with a loud growl, but she shook her head violently. Every white man she'd encountered had offered false kindness before revealing their true nature. Why should this one be different? "I know you don't trust me," Ezra continued, settling into a chair several feet away. "Can't say I blame you. Your people and mine. We ain't got much reason to trust each other." He gestured around the room, pointing to a faded photograph on the mantelpiece. "This was my family's home. My wife Sarah, she loved this place, grew flowers in boxes outside every window." His voice caught slightly. "She would have liked you. Always said children were gifts, no matter where they came from." Ayana didn't understand the words, but something in his tone made her look at the photograph. A smiling woman with kind eyes stood beside a man who looked like Ezra, but younger and happier. A little girl with blonde curls sat between them. "That's Emma," Ezra said, noticing her gaze. "She'd be about your age now if the fever hadn't taken her." The afternoon wore on with Ezra maintaining his respectful distance, while Ayana watched his every move. He went about normal tasks, feeding his horses, checking the fence line visible through the window, preparing his own simple meal. But he always returned to offer her food or water, never forcing, never threatening. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of orange and red, Ayana's resolve finally cracked. The aroma of the broth was too tempting, her hunger too desperate to ignore. When Ezra stepped outside to tend to his horse, she quickly grabbed the bowl and drank deeply, the warm liquid bringing tears to her eyes. Ezra returned to find the empty bowl, but he said nothing about it. Instead, he brought her a blanket, one that smelled of lavender, and carried the faint scent of the woman in the photograph. "You can sleep here tonight," he said, gesturing to the chair. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out what comes next." But as darkness fell, the sound of approaching riders shattered the evening quiet. Ezra grabbed his rifle and peered through the curtains. 4 men on horseback had stopped at his gate, their leader's black hat unmistakable even in the dim light. "Clayton!" Morton's voice boomed across the yard. "We know you got something that belongs to us." Ayana shrank back into the shadows, her face pale with terror. She understood enough to know that the men who had chained her had found her again. Ezra checked his rifle and looked back at the frightened girl. 3 years of grief and whiskey had dulled his protective instincts, but they were awakening now with fierce intensity. "Stay hidden," he told Ayana, not knowing if she understood but hoping his tone conveyed the message. "I won't let them take you." He stepped onto his porch, rifle in hand, facing the 4 mounted men who had come to reclaim what they saw as their property. The standoff that would define both their futures was about to begin. The evening air hung thick with tension as Ezra stepped off his porch, rifle cradled in his arms. Morton sat his horse like a king surveying his kingdom, his 3 companions flanking him with hands resting casually on their gun belts. The dying light cast long shadows across the yard, turning the confrontation into a dance of silhouettes. "Evening, Clayton," Morton drawled, his voice carrying the false politeness of a snake oil salesman. "Mighty fine night for a ride, don't you think? State your business, Morton, then get off my land." Ezra's voice was steady, but his knuckles were white against the rifle stock. Behind him, he could sense Ayana's terror radiating through the thin walls of his home. Morton chuckled, a sound like gravel in a tin can. "Now, that ain't very neighborly. We're just looking for some lost property. Apache girl, about 12 years old. Heard tell she might have wandered this way. Don't know what you're talking about. Sure you don't. Morton leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes glittering in the lamplight spilling from the house. See, we had ourselves a business arrangement with some folks down in Tucson. Very profitable arrangement. Girl was supposed to be delivered 3 days ago. Ezra's stomach turned at the implication, but he kept his expression neutral. Like I said, I don't know nothing about any Apache girl. One of Morton's men, a weasel-faced gunslinger named Pike, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Maybe we should take a look inside, boss. Make sure old Ezra here ain't lying. That's not going to happen, Ezra said, raising his rifle slightly. You boys need to ride on. Morton held up a hand, stopping Pike from dismounting. Easy there, Clayton. No need for unpleasantness yet. He studied Ezra's face in the dim light. You know, I heard about your troubles. Wife and little girl taken by the fever, wasn't it? Terrible thing. Makes a man do strange things sometimes. Makes him think he can replace what he's lost. The words hit Ezra like a physical blow, but he didn't flinch. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Morton's smile was cruel. Lonely man finds a little Apache girl, thinks maybe he can play daddy again. Problem is that particular girl is worth a lot of money to us, $500 to be exact. From inside the house came the soft sound of movement, Ayanna trying to find a better hiding spot. Morton's eyes flicked toward the sound and his smile widened. There she is, he said softly. Told you she was here, boys. Ezra stepped sideways, blocking Morton's view of the front door. I said, get off my land. Now, Clayton, let's be reasonable. Morton's hand moved to his pistol. You return our property, and we'll forget this whole misunderstanding. Hell, we might even throw you a finder's fee. Say $50? She's not property. She's a child. She's a savage, Pike snarled, and she belongs to us. The tension exploded into action as Pike went for his gun. Ezra's rifle boomed, the shot taking Pike clean off his horse before the man's pistol cleared leather. The other two gunmen drew their weapons, but Ezra had already ducked behind his water trough, working the lever action. Morton's horse reared as bullets splintered the wooden trough, sending water cascading across the yard. Take him alive! Morton shouted. We need to know where he's hidden her. But Ezra wasn't hiding. Years of hunting and surviving in hostile territory had honed his instincts. He rolled left as a bullet whined past his ear, came up firing. His second shot caught one of Morton's men in the shoulder, spinning him around. Inside the house, Ayanna crouched behind Sarah's old cedar chest, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. She could hear the gunfire, the shouting, the sound of boots on the porch. The white man who had shown her kindness was fighting for her, maybe dying for her. The thought filled her with a strange mixture of gratitude and terror. The gun battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When the smoke cleared, Pike lay dead in the dirt. Another of Morton's men was wounded and bleeding, and Ezra had taken a bullet in his left arm, but he was still standing, still holding his rifle. Morton sat his horse 20 yards away, his own gun drawn but not fired. This ain't over, Clayton, he snarled. That girl's worth too much money to just walk away from. Then you'll have to go through me to get her, Ezra replied, blood seeping through his shirt sleeve. Maybe I will. Maybe I'll come back with more men. Maybe I'll burn this whole place down around your ears. Morton holstered his weapon. But one way or another, I'm getting what's mine. He wheeled his horse around and galloped into the darkness, his remaining men following. Ezra watched until they disappeared, then staggered back toward the house, his wounded arm throbbing. Ayanna emerged from hiding as he stumbled through the door. For a moment they simply looked at each other, the wounded white rancher and the Apache girl he'd chosen to protect. Then, without a word, she moved to help him, her small hands surprisingly gentle as she examined his wound. Ayanna, she said, pointing to herself. Then she pointed to him, her eyes questioning. Ezra, he said softly. My name is Ezra. She nodded and began tearing strips from her tattered dress, binding his wound with the skill of someone who had seen violence before. As she worked, Ezra realized that this was no longer about temporary shelter or simple human decency. This was about family, the family he'd thought he'd lost forever, and the daughter who had somehow found her way to him through the darkness. 3 weeks had passed since the gunfight, and the Clayton ranch had taken on a different rhythm. Ezra's wounded arm was healing well under Ayanna's careful attention, and the girl had begun to venture beyond the confines of the house. She moved like a shadow at first, always ready to disappear at the first sign of danger, but gradually she began to explore her new world. The language barrier was slowly crumbling. Ayana had a quick mind and eager ears, picking up English words with remarkable speed. Ezra, in turn, struggled with the Apache phrases she taught him, his tongue clumsy around the unfamiliar sounds. But they were learning to communicate in ways that went beyond words, a touch, a gesture, a shared look that conveyed understanding. On this particular morning, Ayana was helping Ezra mend fence posts when she suddenly froze, her head tilted like a deer sensing danger. Her dark eyes scanned the horizon with the intensity of someone who had learned to read the landscape for survival. "What is it?" Ezra asked, following her gaze across the desert scrubland. She pointed to a distant ridge where dust clouds were rising. "Apache," she whispered, the word carrying both longing and fear. Ezra squinted against the morning sun and counted at least 6 riders moving in their direction. His hand instinctively moved toward his rifle, then stopped. These weren't white men coming to cause trouble. These were Ayana's people. "Your family?" he asked gently. Ayana nodded, her expression torn between joy and terror. "Uncle," she said in halting English. "Nalnish. He thinks I am dead." As the riders drew closer, Ezra could make out their Apache features and traditional clothing. They rode with the fluid grace of people born to the saddle, their weapons visible but not drawn. The leader, a man in his 30s with intelligent eyes and a warrior's bearing, raised his hand in a gesture that might have been greeting or warning. "Stay behind me," Ezra told Ayana, but she shook her head. "No, I must speak." She straightened her shoulders, calling out in rapid Apache as the riders approached. The lead rider, clearly Nalnish, pulled up short when he heard her voice. His eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in suspicion as he took in the scene. His niece, supposedly dead for weeks, standing beside a white rancher in the middle of nowhere. A heated exchange in Apache followed, Ayana's voice growing stronger as she spoke. Ezra couldn't understand the words, but he could read the emotions playing across both their faces, Nalnish's relief and anger, Ayana's desperate attempts to explain. Finally, Nalnish switched to broken English, his eyes fixed on Ezra with undisguised hostility. "You take Apache, child, why?" "I found her chained at the old copper mine," Ezra replied carefully. "Men had hurt her. I couldn't leave her there. White men chain her. Now different white man keeps her. Same thing." Ayana stepped forward, speaking rapidly in Apache again. She pointed to Ezra's bandaged arm, then mimicked the actions of someone tending wounds. Her uncle's expression shifted slightly, but his suspicion remained. "She says you fight for her. Take bullet for her." Nalnish's voice carried a note of reluctant respect. "Why white man fight other white men for Apache girl?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, searching for words that would convey the truth without sounding like the ravings of a lonely, grief-stricken man. "Because she needed protecting, because it was the right thing to do." "Right thing is to bring her home to her people." "Yes," Ezra said simply. "It is." The admission clearly surprised Nalnish. He had expected arguments, maybe even violence. Instead, this white rancher was agreeing that Ayana belonged with her tribe, but Ayana herself stepped between them, her young voice carrying surprising authority as she spoke in Apache. The conversation that followed was intense, with gestures toward the ranch, toward the horizon where her people lived, and repeatedly toward Ezra. "She says you are good man," Nalnish translated reluctantly. "Says you have empty lodge, lost daughter. Says spirits sent her to fill empty place." Ezra's throat tightened. "What do you say?" Nalnish was quiet for a long time, studying Ezra's face, his home, the way Ayana positioned herself protectively near the white man. "I say Apache girl belongs with Apache people, but—" He paused, clearly struggling with the words. "But spirits sometimes walk strange paths. Maybe spirits brought her to you for reason." The other Apache warriors murmured among themselves, clearly not all in agreement with their leader's measured response. One of them, a younger man with angry scars across his chest, spoke harshly in Apache. "Tarek says you steal Apache child to replace dead white child. Says it is not natural, not right." Nalnish's translation carried a warning edge. "Maybe he's right," Ezra said quietly. "Maybe I am trying to replace what I lost, but that doesn't change the fact that she was dying when I found her, and she's alive now. That doesn't change the fact that men were going to sell her like cattle." Ayana suddenly stepped forward and began speaking in Apache, her voice passionate and urgent. She gestured toward Ezra, toward the house, toward her uncle. When she finished, tears were streaming down her face. Nalnish's expression had softened considerably. "She says you have good heart. Says you teach her white man words, but also listen when she teaches Apache words. Says you let her pray to Apache spirits, not force white man's God. He paused. She says she wants to stay with you, but also wants to visit her people, wants to walk between two worlds. The request hung in the desert air like smoke from a distant fire. Ezra looked at Ayanna, seeing not just the frightened, chained girl he'd rescued, but a young woman caught between two cultures, trying to forge her own path. "What do you think?" he asked Nalnish. "Is it possible? Can she walk between two worlds?" The Apache leader considered for a long moment. Maybe. If white man truly has good heart, if he lets Apache girl remember where she comes from. He fixed Ezra with a stern look. If he fails her, if he tries to make her forget she is Apache, we will come for her. "I understand," Ezra said, "and I give you my word." As the Apache riders prepared to leave, Ayanna ran to her uncle and embraced him fiercely. They spoke in low, urgent tones, making arrangements, setting boundaries, building a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for generations. When they finally rode away, Ayanna and Ezra stood together in the settling dust, both understanding that their lives had just become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more meaningful. 2 months had passed since Nalnish's visit, and the arrangement seemed to be working. Ayanna spent most of her time at the ranch, learning to read from Sarah's old books and helping Ezra restore the neglected homestead. But twice a week, she would ride out to meet Apache riders at a predetermined spot, maintaining her connection to her birth culture. She was becoming fluent in both worlds, translating not just languages, but ways of life. The autumn morning started like any other, with Ayanna grinding corn for breakfast while Ezra repaired harness leather on the porch. The peace was shattered by the thunder of approaching hooves, not the controlled approach of Apache warriors, but the chaotic charge of angry white men. Sheriff Dalton led the group, his badge glinting in the morning sun. Behind him rode Mayor Hutchins, the town preacher, and 8 other men from Copper Creek, all armed and looking like they meant business. Ezra recognized the expression on their faces. He'd seen it before during Apache raids and lynch mob formations. "Clayton," Sheriff Dalton called out as he reined in his horse. "We need to talk." Ezra set down his leather work and stood slowly, his hand resting casually near his pistol. Through the window, he could see Ayanna freeze at her grinding stone, her body tensing for flight. "Morning, Sheriff. What brings you all the way out here?" "You know damn well what brings us." Mayor Hutchins spurred his horse forward, his face red with indignation. "Word's gotten around about you harboring that Apache girl. People in town are mighty upset about it. What I do on my own land is my own business. Not when it affects the whole community," Preacher Williams interjected, his voice carrying the righteous anger of the faithful. "That girl's people have been raiding settlements, killing Christian families, and here you are, giving aid and comfort to the enemy." Ezra's jaw tightened. "She's a child, not the enemy." "She's a savage," one of the townsmen spat, "and keeping her here is an insult to every God-fearing person in the territory." Sheriff Dalton held up his hand for quiet. "Look, Clayton, I know you mean well. Heard about what happened to your family, and I'm sorry for that. But this situation has got to end. The territorial governor's been getting complaints. People are talking about taking matters into their own hands if the law doesn't act. What exactly are you asking me to do? Turn her over to the Indian agency. They'll see she gets back to her people proper-like." Ezra almost laughed at the bitter irony. "You mean they'll stick her on a reservation where she'll be forgotten and probably die of disease or neglect? Better than living in sin with a white man who's lost his mind with grief," Hutchins sneered. The insult hung in the air like smoke from a branding iron. Ezra took a step forward, his hand moving closer to his gun. "You want to repeat that?" Before anyone could respond, Ayanna appeared in the doorway. She had changed from her Apache dress into one of Sarah's old dresses, altered to fit her smaller frame. Her hair was braided in the white fashion, but she wore a small medicine bag around her neck, a symbol of her dual identity. "Please," she said in clear English, addressing the group of men. "I want to stay here. Ezra is good man. He protects me, teaches me, but also lets me visit my people. I am happy here." Preacher Williams shook his head sadly. "Child, you don't understand. This man is filling your head with confusion. God intended the races to remain separate. It's not natural for you to live like this." "Not natural?" Ayanna's voice grew stronger. "Not natural to be safe? Not natural to learn to read? My Apache grandmother taught me that all knowledge is sacred. My new father teaches me white man's knowledge. Why is this wrong?" The word father rippled through the group like a stone thrown into still water. Several men exchanged meaningful looks, and Ezra knew they had crossed a line in the townspeople's minds. "You see," Hutchins said triumphantly, "the girl's been corrupted. She actually thinks this madman is her father." "And what if I am?" Ezra said quietly. The words surprised even him, but once spoken, he knew they were true. "What if I choose to adopt her legally? What if she chooses to be my daughter?" Sheriff Dalton's expression hardened. "That would be problematic. The law's not clear on such matters, especially involving Indians. Could cause all sorts of complications. Then maybe it's time the law got clearer." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. The townsmen were clearly prepared for violence, their hands near their weapons. Ezra calculated odds and distances, knowing he could take down 3 or 4 before they got him, but also knowing that wouldn't save Ayanna. Then the sound of approaching riders changed everything. Nalnish appeared on the ridge with a dozen Apache warriors, their presence unmistakable even at a distance. At the same time, dust clouds from the opposite direction revealed another group approaching. More townsmen, perhaps, or Morton's gang finally making their move. But as the second group drew closer, Ezra was surprised to see familiar faces from his past. Men he'd served with in the army, neighbors from before his family died, people who knew him as more than just a grief-stricken hermit. Tom Bradshaw, who owned the spread north of town, dismounted and approached the sheriff. "Dalton, what's this about? We heard there might be trouble." "Just handling some official business, Tom. Nothing that concerns you." "Concerns me plenty if you're here to harass Ezra Clayton." Bradshaw looked around the assembled group. "This man saved my cattle from rustlers 2 years running, shared his well water during the drought. Far as I'm concerned, what he does on his own land is his affair." Other voices joined in. Stories of Ezra's past kindness, his service in the Indian Wars, his reputation as an honest man. The narrative the townspeople had constructed of a madman corrupted by grief began to crumble under the weight of testimony from people who actually knew him. Nalnish, meanwhile, had ridden down from the ridge and now sat his horse at the edge of the gathering. His presence was a reminder that this wasn't just about white law. Apache interests were at stake too. "Sheriff," Nalnish said in his careful English, "white men make much noise about Apache girl, but girl is happy. She learns both ways, honors both peoples. Why this bad thing?" Sheriff Dalton found himself caught between competing pressures, the townspeople's prejudice, the territorial government's policies, the testimony of respected citizens, and the implicit threat of Apache retaliation if things went badly. "Look," he said finally, "maybe we can work something out. Clayton, if you were to make this official, legal adoption papers, proper documentation, and if the girl's Apache family agrees to it." He looked uncertainly at Nalnish. "Apache people have discussed this," Nalnish replied solemnly. "Girl was dead to us, now lives again. Sometimes spirits work through strange paths. If White Father honors Apache ways, teaches girl to remember her people, we have no objection." The pronouncement stunned the gathered townspeople. They had expected Apache opposition, not acceptance. Ayanna stepped forward, her young voice carrying across the desert morning. "I choose both worlds. I choose to be Ezra's daughter and Nalnish's niece. I choose to learn white words and Apache songs. I choose family over hatred." As the various groups began to disperse, some grumbling, others nodding approval, Ezra and Ayanna stood together on their porch, watching the sun climb higher into the vast Arizona sky. "Are you sure about this?" Ezra asked quietly. "It won't be easy. People will always question it, always try to make you choose sides." Ayanna smiled, the expression transforming her face from that of a traumatized child to a confident young woman. "In Apache, my name means eternal blossom. Grandmother said it meant I would grow in any ground, under any sky. This is my ground now, and you are my sky." Ezra felt tears prick his eyes, the first he'd shed since Sarah and Emma died. But these were different tears, tears of healing rather than grief. "Then we'll face whatever comes," he said, putting his arm around his adopted daughter's shoulders. "Together." In the distance, Morton and his remaining men watched from a rocky outcrop, but even they could see that the political winds had shifted. The Apache girl was no longer vulnerable prey. She was protected by 2 cultures, surrounded by allies, and most importantly, she had found her place in the world. The unlikely family had won their stand, not through violence but through the simple power of love, transcending the boundaries that others tried to build between peoples. In a land torn by racial hatred and cultural mistrust, they had created something new, a bridge between worlds held together by the unbreakable bonds of chosen family.